It's known as the second-term curse. US presidents historically suffer much worse second terms than first terms, particularly since the end of the Civil War. But just how bad can they get? Welcome to History Buffs Hub. In this video, we're going to take a look at the 10 worst second terms in presidential history. Before we get started, please hit that like and subscribe button down below, and also ring the bell and turn on your notifications. There are several criteria for the list of worst second terms in history. First is everything that entails the job of the president. Did they have any major legislative defeats? What was the impact of their executive orders? Was their foreign policy objective a success? How was their leadership and response in a time of crisis? Second is personal. Were there any scandals that clouded their second term? Did they have any personal tragedies? And third is popularity. We'll do this one in two ways, looking at their approval ratings and looking at the electoral success of their own party. This has nothing to do with whether or not I or anybody else thinks they actually did a good job in their second term, but whether or not their second term went the way they would have wanted it to go and whether or not they accomplished any of their goals for the second term. Now let's dive in. Number 10, Lyndon B. Johnson. Ascending to the presidency with the assassination of John F. Kennedy, LBJ was elected in 1964 over Barry Goldwater with the largest share of the popular vote since before there were actually two viable parties in America. But his second term was marred by his escalation of the Vietnam War. While the US was already there as part of its policy of containment in the Cold War, a series of unfortunate events that included the assassination of the South Vietnamese president 3 weeks before LBJ became president plunged the area into chaos. Fearing the political backlash over losing a war, Johnson lied about North Vietnamese attacks on US ships in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964 as a pretext for dramatically increasing troops in the region in 1965, and with that came a dramatic increase in the draft. Americans were forced to deal with daily stories of troops coming home dead or wounded, live video footage showing the horrors of the war, a first for that time, and the constant fear that either they or one of their loved ones would get drafted. Hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" became a chant among anti-war protesters. There was also a dramatic rise in crime rates during this period, which led Johnson to declare war on crime, setting the early stages for what would become the war on drugs. The war on crime and Vietnam War fractured LBJ's base and led to the rise of the New Left, a coalition of young people who were anti-war and supported the counterculture movement. Johnson had already lost the traditional Southern bloc of the Democratic Party with his passage of the Civil Rights Act. His goodwill with minority communities also fell apart thanks to Martin Luther King Jr. and Cesar Chavez openly opposing the war, the FBI's open hostility to the civil rights movement, and the arrest of people like Muhammad Ali for evading the draft. The assassinations of Malcolm X and MLK only added to the chaos. After nearly losing the New Hampshire primary, LBJ chose not to be the Democratic nominee in 1968, but that only created more chaos for his party, as the wildly popular Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated in June of that year. The riots and protests at the '68 Democratic Convention in Chicago ended with LBJ's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, getting the nomination, but he lost the election to Richard Nixon. After LBJ's presidency, Republicans held the White House for 20 of the next 24 years. The fracturing of the Democratic Party and Vietnam disaster would seem like reasons for LBJ to be higher on this list, but he had far too many significant legislative accomplishments in his second term for that to be the case, including the Voting Rights Act, passage of Medicare and Medicaid, Higher Education Act, Clean Air and Water Acts, and Fair Housing Act. Those all still have a major impact on American life to this day. Number 9, Thomas Jefferson. The second term curse largely avoided the founding fathers who were president, but they still had some problems. George Washington dealt with the Whiskey Rebellion and the rise of political parties, and James Monroe dealt with the growing debate over slavery and the split of the Democratic-Republican Party. But Thomas Jefferson's second term takes the cake. He had to deal with the trial of his former vice president, Aaron Burr. It was bad enough that Burr shot and killed one of America's founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton, but he was also arrested in 1807 and tried for treason over suspicions that he was involved in a plan to get the western states at that time in the Union to break off and form their own government. Adding insult to injury, Burr was acquitted after Jefferson himself ordered the prosecution. From a policy perspective, Jefferson was forced to uphold the United States' position of neutrality during the Napoleonic Wars, specifically the conflicts involving France and Britain, which was extremely difficult for him because of his personal connections to the French. To force those countries to respect American neutrality, Jefferson signed the Embargo Act of 1807 passed by Congress, banning trade with all foreign nations. It led to an economic disaster, and he was forced to repeal it just 2 years later. There are some positives of Jefferson's second term, to be fair. He signed a bill banning the slave trade in 1808, but there is a legitimate argument that such a move resulted in slavery lasting even longer in the US because of how valuable domestic slaves became overnight. You could say that it was still worth it given how inhumane the slave trade itself was, but honestly, the slave trade didn't really end. Illegal importation of slaves into the US was still common in many southern states afterward. Also, Jefferson's Democratic-Republican Party maintained power over the Federalists, with James Madison winning by a landslide in the 1808 presidential election and keeping the party in control of Congress. So it wasn't all bad. Number 8. Abraham Lincoln. He got shot. Seriously, if you get assassinated in your second term, I'd say that's kind of a sucky term. The real question is, why wasn't he higher? Well, he had some rare successes during the 1 month of his second term. 6 days before he was killed, Robert E. Lee surrendered, effectively securing victory for the Union in the Civil War. Lincoln's political efforts had also ensured that the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery would pass, even if it wasn't ratified until nearly 8 months after his assassination. Given his personal tragedies that had already taken place and everything he had dealt with regarding the war, I can safely say I believe by 1865, Lincoln would willingly have given his life for those two things to happen. However, Lincoln's death also ascended Andrew Johnson to the presidency, arguably the worst president ever. Number 7. Ulysses S. Grant. Grant's second term was surrounded by scandals involving his cabinet members, starting with kickbacks from the Transcontinental Railroad that forced him to replace his vice president before his re-election. He also had the whiskey ring scandal, in which whiskey distillers bribed government officials to evade taxes. By the end of his second term, his Attorney General, along with his Secretaries of War, Navy, and Interior, had all been accused of taking bribes. Grant's second term also included the Panic of 1873, the first global depression in the Industrial Age. His peace policy with Native Americans was in direct contrast to his encouragement of frontier settlements as well, resulting in numerous violent clashes with Native American communities, most notably the Battle of Little Bighorn in the Great Sioux Wars of 1876, which is famous for General Custer's last stand. The constant violence in the South led to the public souring on Grant's Reconstruction efforts. All of this resulted in the Republican Party getting destroyed in the 1874 midterms, losing over 90 seats in the House to surrender control of the chamber for the first time in 14 years. They did technically hold the presidency in 1876, with Rutherford B. Hayes beating Samuel J. Tilden, but Tilden won the popular vote, and the race ended in an electoral college tie, which sent it back to Congress. Hayes was only given the tiebreaker after an informal agreement by the Republicans to withdraw from the South, so while Grant's party held on to power, he had to give up on Reconstruction in the process. Number 6. Grover Cleveland. The first Democrat elected president in the post-Civil War era, Cleveland was first elected in 1884, ending the Republicans' 6th presidential election winning streak dating back to 1860, still a record for a single party. He lost the White House to Republican Benjamin Harrison in 1888, but returned to win it back in 1892, the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms until Donald Trump. Cleveland's second term was a disaster before he even took office. The Panic of 1893 began 2 months before his inauguration and became the worst economic catastrophe in U.S. history until the Great Depression. Although Cleveland couldn't be blamed for the panic, fair or not, he was blamed for the fact that the conditions didn't improve during his presidency. In terms of legislative success, he did repeal the Sherman-Silver Act, which passed in 1890 and forced the government to buy silver to increase the money supply, and is blamed for the panic. However, even if it was necessary, it played a role in numerous bank runs and bank failures, and only increased the economic hardship of the poor and working class. This led to a populist rage against wealth inequality in the Gilded Age in general, which Cleveland was now the face of. He only increased that rage with how he handled worker strikes, most notably when he sent federal troops to break up a railroad strike known as the Pullman Strike. There was also a major coal miner strike during that time. This populist sentiment split Cleveland's party and wrecked it electorally as the Democrats lost 110 seats in the 1894 midterms. 2 years later, Republican William McKinley won the presidency, ushering in the fifth party system and a Republican trifecta, where one party controls the House, Senate, and presidency, for 16 years. While history has rehabilitated Cleveland's image to some degree, there's no doubt that his electoral failures, unpopularity upon leaving office, and state of the economy under him during that time made for a miserable second term. Number 5. Harry Truman. Rising to the presidency on the death of America's most significant and beloved political figure of the 20th century, Franklin Roosevelt, Truman took office with America in the midst of the deadliest global conflict in human history, World War II. After winning the war, Truman shocked Thomas Dewey to win re-election in 1948 with his aggressive populist campaigning and his significant support for labor and civil rights. However, the issues that made him an underdog in that election only got worse in his second term. There was dramatic inflation after the war thanks to the removal of price controls, and even though it wasn't as bad as Truman's first term, the cumulative effect made life really hard for Americans. Also, American troops returning home faced a massive housing shortage during this time, largely because of the fact that wartime efforts halted development, and before that was the Great Depression, where there was no money for development. Truman's own Cold War policy, known as the Truman Doctrine, also suffered a real setback in his second term. His philosophy of supporting efforts across the globe to resist communist influence led to US involvement in the Korean War. Because the war ended in a stalemate, many Americans saw it as a waste of lives and resources. On the other end, beloved War General Douglas MacArthur criticized Truman for not being aggressive enough in the war, so Truman fired him, which backfired politically since MacArthur was such a popular figure for efforts during World War II. Truman was so unpopular that he decided not to seek his party's nomination for another term in 1952. The ensuing result was Republican Dwight Eisenhower beating Adlai Stevenson in a landslide in the presidential election that year, and the Republicans taking back both the House and the Senate, giving them a trifecta for the first time in 20 years. On the day he left office, Truman's approval rating was 32%, which remains the lowest on record for any outgoing president who completed his term. Number 4. Richard Nixon. Re-elected by the largest electoral landslide in U.S. history in 1972 over George McGovern, Nixon carried all but one state and Washington, D.C. He became the first Republican to sweep the South and seemed poised to usher in a new era of politics. Then came disaster. The Yom Kippur War broke out in 1973, in which a coalition of Arab nations, led by Egypt and Syria, attacked U.S. ally Israel in an attempt to reclaim land lost during the Six-Day War in 1967. The U.S.'s support for Israel led to a huge oil crisis at home, as the Arab nations in OPEC imposed an oil embargo against them in retaliation. And that was just on the policy front. Scandal was the real story of Nixon's second term. His vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned in 1973 due to criminal charges related to bribery and extortion from his time as governor of Maryland. But of course, the biggest story was Watergate. Nixon's administration used numerous illegal means to cover up a break-in at Democratic headquarters in the Watergate Hotel in 1972, and as the walls closed in on him, he became the first president ever to resign from office in 1974, which he did to avoid impeachment. The scandal itself honestly pales in comparison to that of many other presidents, but it ended his presidency, and being forced to leave due to scandal makes for a really bad term. Nixon's party took a huge hit, losing 49 seats in the House in 1974 and 4 in the Senate, giving the Democrats a filibuster-proof majority, and he left office with a 22% approval rating, the lowest of any outgoing president on record. Number 3. George W. Bush. The first sitting president in 40 years to be re-elected while his party increased its majorities in both chambers of Congress, and the first Republican to do so in 80 years, George W. Bush proclaimed a mandate after he beat John Kerry in the 2004 presidential election. Then came a series of events that made him wildly unpopular and checks all 3 boxes of our criteria in a negative way. It all started with a major legislative defeat in early 2005 when he attempted to partially privatize Social Security. Bush failed to get it through Congress, and the backlash from senior citizens was so severe that it pushed his approval rating below 50% by May. Later that year, Hurricane Katrina became the worst natural disaster in American history. FEMA's seemingly lack of coordinated response and the National Guard taking 3 days to be called in, despite thousands of people trapped in the city with no food or water, was a major stain on Bush's image. He only made it worse with his optics, which included not returning to Washington from his vacation in Texas until 2 days after the storm hit, telling the FEMA director that he was doing a heck of a job, and doing a photo op in Air Force One of him surveying the damage in the city amidst the horrifying images of what everybody saw down below. Less than a month after Katrina, Bush also failed to push through the nomination of Harriet Miers to the Supreme Court. Miers was perceived to lack experience and appeared to be a more partisan hire than usual since she had worked in the Bush White House. She withdrew her nomination at the end of October. Bush's presidency only got worse in 2006 as the public dramatically turned against the Iraq War. The lack of weapons of mass destruction found, increased sectarian violence in the region, and daily stories of dead American soldiers with no end to this war in sight led many to sour on what was happening. And after uniting behind Bush to fight al-Qaeda in his first term in response to 9/11, many grew angry that the organization now seemed stronger and he still hadn't caught Osama bin Laden. As more people learned Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, anti-war sentiment only grew. Scandal also plagued the administration's second term, as the vice president's chief of staff was convicted on obstruction of justice for his role in the outing of CIA agent Valerie Plame. Bush commuting his sentence only made him look worse. Also, the firing of 8 U.S. attorneys in 2007 sparked numerous investigations, and there were high-profile resignations from the administration, including Karl Rove and Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld. Then came the Great Recession. The collapse of the subprime mortgage crisis led to millions of home foreclosures and triggered the 2008 financial crisis, the worst economic crash since the Great Depression. Fair or not, Bush took the brunt of the blame, and his decision to bail out the banks and the auto industry, while approved by Congress and maybe have been necessary to prevent a depression, made him the face of what everybody hated about crony capitalism. Bush left office with his approval more underwater than any outgoing president who completed his term on record to that point. Nixon was more underwater when he left office, but he didn't complete his term, and technically while Truman had a lower approval rating by 2 points, Bush's disapproval rating was 5 points higher than Truman's. His unpopularity did severe damage to his party too, as they lost the House and the Senate in the 2006 midterms after holding it for 12 years, and in 2008, they lost the White House to Barack Obama, who became the first black president and won with the largest margin of victory for any president of the 21st century. Or as Chris Rock so eloquently put it,
Bush up so bad, he made it hard for the white man to run for president.
And indeed, it was that bad. Although Obama ran against John McCain, a war hero who seemed like the perfect candidate, Obama focused exclusively on attacking Bush's policies, and the heart of his attacks on McCain were simply McCain being too similar to Bush since they were in the same party. This was a real attack ad from that time.
I am not President Bush. True, but you did vote with Bush 90% of the time.
Early in Obama's presidency, he and the Democrats had a filibuster-proof Senate with 60 seats and the largest majority in Congress for either party in 30 years, all due to the backlash against Bush. Number 2, William McKinley. Again, he was assassinated, and unlike Lincoln, he had no second-term accomplishments to go with his assassination. No other explanation needed. Before we get to number 1, I want to address a couple of presidents who did not make this list. Since Nixon was on here, many might ask why Bill Clinton wasn't, as he was impeached his second term. The Monica Lewinsky affair is certainly a scandal, and given the fact that it led to him getting caught cheating on his wife, it's probably a personal situation he didn't want either. However, Clinton's approval remained high throughout his second term, actually peaking at 71% the day he was impeached. In the midst of the scandal also, the Democrats picked up seats in the 1998 midterms, and Clinton remains the only president since Reconstruction whose party did that. That, combined with legislative successes like the Children's National Health Insurance Program, kept him off this list. Also, Barack Obama certainly had a rough second term with the IRS targeting scandal, the Edward Snowden leaks, and the bungled rollout of the Affordable Care Act. His party got wiped out in the 2014 midterms and ended with Donald Trump winning the 2016 election while Republicans held the House and the Senate. Failure to pass gun control, immigration reform, and nominate a Supreme Court justice after Antonin Scalia's death also hurt him. However, his own approval never bottomed out, and he left office well above 50% in popularity, and his party did pick up seats in the 2016 elections in the House and the Senate, despite a Republican trifecta. So it just wasn't enough for him to be on here. And the #1 worst second term in history? Woodrow Wilson. Narrowly re-elected in 1916, Woodrow Wilson won on the promise of keeping America out of World War I and as a reward for remaining neutral in the war to that point. "He kept us out of war" was the campaign slogan. Barely a month after his second inauguration, Wilson broke that promise. The pretext for involving the US in World War I was a series of German attacks on civilian ships, including American merchant ships in the war zone, and Wilson got the US involved on the side of the Allies against the Germans. He instituted a draft in May of 1917. The backlash was immediate thanks to the isolationist instinct of Americans and the large number of people of German descent in the country. Wilson responded to the backlash with the Espionage and Sedition Acts, allowing him to jail opponents of the draft and the war, such as Eugene V. Debs, which unfortunately was upheld by the Supreme Court at that time, but it certainly decreased his popularity. After the war ended in 1918, Wilson seemingly had success with his role in the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 and the establishment of the League of Nations in 1920, but he failed to get his own country to join the League of Nations. So that became a major failure. Then there was the Spanish flu outbreak, which began in the spring of 1918, and the combination of the flu and World War I reduced life expectancy in the US by nearly 12 years. There was also the major post-war economic recession in 1920 that lasted through the end of Wilson's presidency. Electorally speaking, Republicans picked up 24 seats in the House and took back control of the Senate by picking up 5 seats in 1918. They added 10 more seats in the Senate to get to 59 and 64 seats in the House to hold over 300 in 1920. Republican presidential candidate Warren G. Harding won in a landslide in 1920 with over 400 electoral votes against James B. Cox. Harding exclusively campaigned against Wilson's policies, barely even mentioning Cox, and began a period of 12 straight years with a Republican trifecta. Wilson's second term was so bad that it brought a sharp end to the progressive era too, as Harding campaigned on a platform of return to normalcy, which signified a return to the laissez-faire economics of the Gilded Age and ushered in the Roaring '20s. Oh, and on a personal level, Wilson suffered a horrible stroke in 1919, which was kept secret from the public. His wife Edith handled many of the presidential duties for the rest of his term after that. Thanks for hopping into the History Buffs Hub to watch this video. Who would you say had the worst second term in presidential history? Please tell us in the comments, and once again, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button for more history videos in the future.